Gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to this seminar of the Illiberalism Studies Program at the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at GW. We are here with one of our good colleague, Michael Minkenberg, who will be presenting or having a broad discussion on what he calls precarious democracy, the East European radical right's interaction with mainstream party, and its effect on comparative perspective, which is largely based on his book that was just published, Depleting Democracy. We were commenting on the climate change cover, which I think is relevant because democracy is challenged by climate change and vice versa. So I think it totally makes sense. And the brown color, exactly. So excellent visualization of what we are discussing today. Michael is professor of comparative politics at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt, Germany. The order. He held the Max Weber Chair for German and European Studies at New York universities. He taught comparative politics in Gothenburg, Heidelberg, and in the US at Cornell and Columbia. So he's a really widely traveled and kind of transnational scholar, and he has been working on radical right and liberal democracy, relationship between religion and politics in Western society, and more recently, state architecture in capital cities. And so, Michael, we are delighted to have you with us today. Thank you so much for coming. I give you the floor to present, and then we will have time for a Q&A session.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be back in Washington after 4 years hiding from the virus and other things. Now I'm safe again to travel. It's my first transatlantic trip since October 2019. And that last trip took me to Washington, D.C. So I'm a frequent traveler when it comes to the district, and I'm really happy to be back here. It's my hometown, USA. I've spent many years here. So yeah, let me start with this book. It's not my own book or single-authored book, but it's written with my assistant at Viadrina, Susanna Weg, a Hungarian scholar. She is working with me, and she was part of the project that led to that book. And for those who are interested, I have a few flyers. I won't want to pass them around. If you want to take a closer look, you can keep them. There is also an order coupon with a discount, but it ran out at the end of August. So I don't know how much, whether you can negotiate with a publisher. In America, it's still August or something. It's in Britain, so maybe they might be accessible to arguments that have to do with British-US relations. So yeah, feel free to take this. Maybe if you can pass this around and keep it. I'll pass this on. So let me start with, how do I change the page here? Oh yeah. Yeah. So that you already presented the book. Let me just say, this book was a project that started already 10 years, 11 years ago with some little money, with a field trip into Eastern Europe where I built up a network with scholars in each of these countries. And then we have the small project that ended up with an edited volume with Routledge, Transforming the Transformation. And built on that book, I designed a bigger outline proposal for a project that I sent in to the Thyssen Foundation, which is a major research foundation in Germany. It's a private foundation with the Thyssen Company, and they, as you may know, they have some moral pressure to do something good, and so they keep funding these kind of things, not just other more natural science projects. So I was really happy to get this grant, and they were very good in unbureaucratic in supporting the project. And out of that project, a 3-year project, we put together this book. And I'm not only talking about the book, but the most important results having to do with the title here have to do with what we did in the book. So this is the roadmap for my little talk here. I have limited time. Normally I speak for 2 hours, but today I have only half an hour. So let me see how much I can squeeze into those 30 minutes. Let me start with some concepts so you know what I'm talking about when I say radical right. As you all know, there's a lot of terms floating out there, and there's an illiberalism program now, which adds to this discussion, populism, extremism, and then fascism, of course. What do I mean? You know these faces, so this is what comes up when you think about the extreme right or radical right in Europe. Let's not forget, there's more. I start with an ideological definition based on core ideas, and not in terms of people or voters or styles, but really an ideology which is rooted in the myth of the homogeneous nation. And this ultranationalism, I call it romantic ultranationalism, romantic because it's a romanticized idea of the nation that has never really existed, but it's being projected onto politics and used as an argument or as a stick to deal with political opponents. And ultimately this concept, ultranationalism, leads to the hollowing out or the undermining of liberal and pluralistic democracy, because the idea of homogeneity is more or less the opposite of a pluralistic society and democracy that deals with it, and goes also against principles of universalism and individualism, because it's a groupthink thing that dominates here and not individual civil rights or liberties. The criteria for exclusion they vary. Usually we look at ethnic criteria, but I would like to stress that there are also religious and other criteria that are used for the in-group, out-group distinctions. But in any case, it's between illiberal and anti-liberal. We can discuss where to draw the line. I'm not so sure myself. I haven't found the final answer yet. But it's an interesting question. What's the difference between illiberal politics and anti-liberal politics? The radical right tends to be more anti-liberal than illiberal, but it starts often with illiberalism. Maybe that's what it means. So let's go. How do you define this? Some people like letters, like Karls Mütter, who I'm seeing next week in Athens, Georgia, when I give another talk on the German situation. Other people like me like bubbles. I like to use the algebraic model for this because I think it makes it more visible or immediately plausible what this means. For me, the radical right is not something different from the extreme right or from fascism. Some people say the radical right is moderate and the extreme right is not. But I would say that's an illusion, because there are fluid boundaries and there's a lot of dynamics and movement. So you can have a moderate party that radicalizes. Look at Fidesz in Hungary. So I use radical right as the mega category here based on my definition, and then I distinguish different versions. One of them, the core version or the most extreme version, would be fascism and extreme right, with a total annihilation of anything that resembles democracy and liberalism. Although some people claim that's the real democracy, like Carl Schmitt, but let's not get into that in the Q&A round. So this is how I use this. And populism, then, to me, is something that goes across all these variants. Populism is, for me, more like a style or a strategy and not an ideology. Neither thick nor thin, but a style. I'm going with Benjamin Moffat and others here. It's a way you approach politics, how you approach political opponents or your own ideas. And so you can have populist right-wingers, you can have populist left-wingers, but you can also have populist center. The FDP in Germany is a very good example. They have populism in them. If you look at the history of the FDP, there were quite a few people who were populists, the way they used the media, the way they ran their campaigns. So it's nothing to do with the far right, although Karls Mütter and Kaltwasser, they argue there's a natural tendency that the two go together. Yes, but that depends on how you define the people. When you look at all the definitions of populism, it always ends up with saying the people as a homogeneous group, the decent people against the elite. But if you look a little closer, you end up with Carl Schmitt. He has started this debate on the homogeneous people as the basis for democracy in his reading. And that's illiberal or anti-liberal, even if you want. And that's where I also go. That it's not the people is the core problem with populist definitions, because some say don't go further than saying the people, and if they go further, they end up with the radical right or with right-wing extremism. Or if you look at Podemos and left-wingers, totally different concept of the people. Even not the kind of people that we think about people in terms of either democracy or illiberal concepts like the radical right. That's a different kind of people, and I'm not going with Laclau and Chantal Mouffe here, because I don't want to go into detail. But anyway, for me, this is not an ideology. It's not useful to distinguish one group of parties from another group of parties, like radical right, radical left, communism, fascism, Christian democracies or democracy. So that all is fine, the party family logic, but populism does not add a new family to that list. That's my reading of it. So the other big term, of course, is democracy. I'm not going in there, really. I just want to say that I start with Robert Dahl's polyarchy concept, and what I find really interesting in that concept is, among other things, that he puts the category of inclusiveness at the center of his definition. And that's exactly where the radical right comes in, because they are exclusivist. And so what we did in the project is using a concept of democracy that focuses on the aspect of inclusiveness, by also accepting all the other institutional definitions that Dahl offers and others offer, but the main focus or angle that we used was the inclusiveness angle, and that means how do we measure radical right impact by looking at inclusiveness issues or criteria. I'll come to that in a moment. And then this word depletion, the book shows already where we want to go with that, what we do mean, that this is an ecological or medical term, but we use it for politics to distinguish it from backsliding and all the other fashionable concepts, because they usually look at the institutional arrangements, and we want to shift away from that and look at the values that underlie the functioning of these institutional arrangements, including inclusiveness. So if you curtail the rights of particular groups because they don't belong, you're not changing the institutional makeup per se, but you cut short the underlying idea of inclusiveness by excluding them. At first with very simple things like maybe cultural rights of self-expression, recognition, and it can end into the complete exclusion from all participatory rights. But that's the extreme point. They don't usually start there. And if you do that, then you have something like apartheid. So depletion can lead to backsliding in an institutional way, but it doesn't have to. Also, we look at the processual aspect, that is the dynamics of the whole process, and not so much the end point. When do we reach it? We don't know, but we are on the way, and then we can compare nations and see how far they have gone on this trajectory, and especially what the radical right has to do with all that. So then the effect question, that's the core interest in this book. Well, how do we measure effects, or how do we define and measure effects? Well, we start with electoral strength and the relationship to mainstream parties. You can do any kind of thing. You can look at mood swings in the public, you can look at courts and their reaction in the judicial sphere. We thought we start with a very simple party research perspective and look at how mainstream parties deal with the radical right, because that's the way to measure effects in the political arena. Very simple. You cannot simply look at electoral strength, you have to combine that with how these parties react, whether they see them as a threat or maybe an opportunity to build majorities. So blackmail potential and coalition potential are important. This is Sartori, if you know party research, comparative party research. And then, of course, some context factors, but we didn't look into detail here because that's too far. This is too big. This is maybe something for another study. This is the model we came up with when we put everything together. The relevance aspect, we looked at the threshold, let's say 4% in parliamentary elections over a longer period. We don't want to study flash parties that have 20% and then disappear. That's often a problem when people average those figures and they get a high number, but there is one flash phenomenon in there that distorts everything. We want to look at 4 parliamentary elections, not necessarily consecutive elections, but 4 parliamentary elections over 20 years where this party got at least 4% in each of these 4 elections. If we have that, then we say they're electorally relevant, and this is a very conventional measure. If you look at Sartori and others, they usually have the 4 or 5%. Germans have the 5% hurdle, but that's a German peculiarity. I think 4% is more realistic. We can also debate whether maybe the 5% hurdle should be changed, because there were lots of parties that get 4 point something, and then you ask yourself, there's lots, like the Greens in the beginning, they got 3.8, I think. They were in the state parliaments, but not in the Bundestag, so they had a debate already whether that should be lowered because it's too exclusionary. Strategic reaction of the other parties, co-optation or stigmatization, that there's a positive engagement, negative engagement dimension. And then we look at minority rights. First we look at Galtan dimensions in general ways, so whether parties shift along that broad dimension of libertarian green alternative ideas or traditional authoritarian nationalist ideas. That's what it means, a social-cultural dimension. We don't look at the economic issues. Then we look at specifically at the minority issues. Where do parties stand on minority rights? Are they in favor of expanding them or acknowledging them at all, or are they against them? And then we move from position shifts, you see this in the box on the right, to impact on policy. And the final question is then, when we put all this together, what does it mean for democratic quality? So this is how we approached it. Let's take a quick look. These are the context factors in the study. And I would say in most studies, people look at nation building and post-communist legacies, and there's, for this particular topic, the homogeneity in ethnic terms mostly, because minority issues are very important in Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, there are also minorities, but they play out in a different way, and immigration is the more important issue for the radical right. But in Eastern Europe, until recently, there was hardly any immigration, so the minority question, the Brubaker triad, as you may know, is important because the borders were drawn after World War I, when most of these countries came into being across the settlement areas of particular groups, and so there were Poles, and outside of Poland there were Germans, outside of Germany there were Hungarians, outside of Hungary, and so on and so on. So then the regime context is important, party competition, is it stable, is it fluctuating a lot, are there stable alignments? This means also translates then into electoral volatility. If there are no stable alignments, it's every 4 years, if things are up for grabs. There is no strong identification with any particular party. There's a difference to Western Europe, where you still have a much higher adherence to the parties, even though party identification goes down there as well, but the level is different. The Eastern Europeans had very little time to build up that kind of affiliation in the first place. Before they knew it, the constitutions changed again. New parties came, old parties disappeared, new entrepreneurs showed up out of nowhere, sometimes from the US going into the Baltics. I think it was the guy in Lithuania who was a US citizen and came back to Lithuania and then became a political operator. So we for the project, because we were dealing with the radical right in particular, some aspects were not so important, like the regime characteristics here or the nation building issues, but homogeneity and party competition were crucial for the project. So this is just an overview. I don't want to go to details, but for all the 7 countries we studied in the project, we looked at these points and volatility, system closure, open or not for newcomers. And then the radical right strength, we divided this into 2 phases after 2000, before EU accession, the 2004, and then after 2010 to 2014, when even Bulgaria and Romania were part of the EU. That is a certification of a certain level of democratic consolidation. And then mainstream party strategies that we studied. And also we looked at state response, but later on we decided that's too messy, we have to leave this out because the data collection was a problem here. For all these 7 countries. Why these 7 countries? These are countries that have different characteristics in terms of radical right relevance. In Estonia and Czech Republic, the radical right was basically irrelevant until recently. There was none. There were some small parties like the Workers' Party in the Czech Republic, which was then banned, or before that the Republicans, but they disappeared very quickly after the breakup of Czechoslovakia. Similar in Estonia, there was nationalism in Estonia, but not a radical right party that fit our definition. Then we have countries like Slovakia and Bulgaria, where the radical right has been in power several times, in coalition with a senior partner. In Hungary, the radical right is also in power, but this is a different story because the Fidesz was not always a radical right party, so we wouldn't include that with the others. We also looked at Jobbik, of course, that pushed the Fidesz at some points. Same in Poland with LPR and Konfederacja and the Peace Party that also moved into the radical right camp. So this is the rationale for these 7 countries. We didn't include the other 2 Baltic states and the post-Yugoslav states, because there is a different story, especially in Croatia. If you look at the war in the 90s, things were quite divergent. Slovenia, yes, we were debating this, but then we said, no, we want the post-Soviet sphere. This is all post-Soviet, so there's a big commonality here. And Tito was not Stalin. So the argument we have is that those parties do have an influence, but they need cooperative reactions or positive engagement by the mainstream parties. And what's really important is, once they have an impact, it doesn't simply go back when they disappear. So this is a sticky thing, stickiness argument that we use in these constellations. The time frame was 2000 to 2016, so here we have the beginning of the preparation for EU membership already. They were all negotiating with the EU at that point, and the 90s were over. So basically the time of flux and insecurity and sorting out was more or less over. Poland had finally its own constitution in 97. So it's a moment where things are settling, or have started to settle to a large degree. And 2016 we stopped. First the project started in 2016, so we couldn't go on and on until 2022. Second, 2016 was also the year when the impact of the so-called refugee crisis happened in Eastern Europe, and we thought this gets messy if we conflate that with the minority question. So we have some asylum questions in here for this period, for the last 2 years of our period, but that's not at the center of it. We want to look at these 16 years before what I would call the humanitarian crisis, and then others, or maybe even myself, will then pick up from there and can take some of the data and continue it with regard to the refugee situation, and then also the Ukrainian refugee situation that started last year, which then adds a new layer to all of this. These are the parties we look at. This is the tableau. In bold means more relevant, not bold means less relevant. And so either several times in the parliament or government participation. That is a high level of relevance if a party is a member of a coalition and a government. So this is what we have. And here Fidesz and PiS are also counted as radical right parties in the second period that we discuss here until 2016. And you probably know a lot about these parties, so I don't go into many details, but what we find here, compared to Western Europe, high level of volatility when it comes to voters. We also have a shorter time span. In another study that I published in 2017, I looked at lifespan of these parties, and it is obvious that in Eastern Europe, the radical right parties have a much shorter lifespan than in Western Europe. You have 30 plus years in Western Europe for the Vlaams Belang, if you skip the name change, or the Rassemblement, or the FPÖ. That's a long time, almost 30 years of that. None in the East has a 30-year life. It's just not the case. So usually less than 15 years, this is the average value, and in the West more than 20 years. Membership figures are much lower than in Western Europe too. Now I heard that in the Czech Republic, in the Slovak Republic, there's a new party called Republika that is a splinter from the Kotleva party, and that picks up lots of members quickly because they're unhappy with Kotleva. Ideologically, these parties are more extreme than in the West until recently. The SPD in the Czech Republic is more or less the ethnocentrist version that we have in the West, but all the other parties that started earlier, they are more biologically racist than ethno-pluralist in terms of the Nouvelle Droite concept. Islam is still not so important except for the SPD in the Czech Republic, and maybe some other, in Ataka of course in Bulgaria. Many parties have paramilitary tendencies. The Jobbik founded its own paramilitary movement, the Hungarian Guard, to go around and clean up the streets of suburbs and small towns. There's a lot of anti-liberal religiosity, the fusion of the dominant religion with nationalism, and often open support for anti-democratic symbols or regimes of the interwar period. Linka in the Slovak Republic, In Poland is Dmowski, who came back. No one knew who Dmowski was in the 90s, and suddenly with the LPR, Dmowski is back. You can see him even on the walls in Warsaw. There's a graffiti on the lower left that someone has photographed. He was a fierce anti-liberal in the interwar period in Poland, anti-Western, anti-American, anti-democratic, and anti-Semitic. Then on the right you see Kotleba, on the lower right, the leader of the Kotleba party, Slovakia Our People. That is a good example that this paramilitary thinking, that he recycled a uniform of the Slovak nation in World War II, which, if you know Slovak history, this was a Nazi satellite state and not an independent nation like Poland or Hungary. So the Hungarian Guard, up one way up, they like also these movements and symbols of the 30s. This is the uniform of the Arrow Cross movement, the fascist movement of the 1930s. And there's territorial revisionism. That's also something you don't find in the West. Even the German AfD does not want Pomerania back now. It's not but even Fidesz goes in that direction. You have Jobbik on the upper left. The Greater Hungary idea is also prevalent in Fidesz. They don't want to change borders because they know it's not going to work. But they do everything below that level to reach out to Hungarians abroad, which leads to frequent tensions with the Slovak Republic. Or Romania. They call it Bessarabia, it was the old name, but it's Moldavia now. They want that back, and the AUR is a pan-Romanian party that came into being a few years ago. They want all Romanians in one state. That means a lot in that region. So they really want to get Moldavia back. And there are some Romanians in Moldavia that work with the people in Romania to do that, to overcome that division. So this is different from the West. We don't have that in the West. I don't know any party that seriously advocates the redrawing of boundaries, national boundaries and borders in the West, as these parties, some of these, not all, but quite a few in the East. So if you add this up, you get some level of systemic opposition to the democratic order that has been established after 1990. So let's go at the interaction quickly because my time is running out. How do we study this? We use expert surveys for the party level. That is, we use what's already there, the Chapel Hill expert surveys, and they have the Galtan dimension for most of these parties, and a minority question, which is good. What they didn't have is asylum, for example, or refugee issues. So we have the VES, which is the Viadrina expert survey. We did this with the money from the Thyssen Foundation, and we contacted all the people in my network all over Eastern Europe to help us. So we had a list of 5 people per country on average, doing the same thing that the Chapel Hill people were doing, but then we added the asylum question for 2016. But then we had to stop because we didn't have enough money to repeat that every year. So this expert survey stops in 2016. But we got good results, so they were very responsive when we asked them to locate the parties. And then this is just a snapshot, one example. You see on the upper left Slovakia on the ethnic minority positions, how the Slovak National Party was always extreme, got always the full 10 points on the left-right scale on ethnic minority, especially because of the anti-Hungarian mobilization. But then if you look at closely, you look at the Smer party, which is interesting because they are probably winning the next election and providing the new prime minister in the Slovak Republic, who is pro-Putin. Yes. He's a NATO country, and there's going to be a pro-Putin prime minister in Slovakia. This is going to be interesting, not pleasant, just interesting. You see that Smer, which is a social democratic party, it's still a member of the International Social Democratic Association, moves closer and closer to the SNS position on minority positions. And also the Fico, the leader of that party then and now, used a lot of populism in his campaigns. He copied that from the SNS. So they got closer and closer. Then, after 2015, SNS moved towards the center, and that was the moment when the Kotleba party showed up, that guy with the military uniform I showed you. That is now replacing the SNS on the far right, and now the Republika party, which is a splinter of the Kotleba party, is even further to the right. It's a clearly neo-fascist party, and they are said to have chances to enter the parliament in the next elections. They have already 5 deputies because they split off from the LSNS group, the Kotleba group, and created their own party. So they are already in the Bratislava parliament. So there's movement on the far right in the Slovak Republic, but you see that the trend is, except for the Hungarian party at the bottom, this is the minority party for Hungarians, the parties tend to move towards the right on minority issues. Similar in Bulgaria, where a post-communist party, the Bulgarian Socialist Party, BSP, they had a coalition with Ataka, the far-right party. They also moved towards the Ataka position on minority issues. And when parties leave parliament, like in Slovakia, these other parties don't move back to their previous position, so they don't become moderate again, but they more or less stay the course. There are very few exceptions to this trend. In the Czech Republic, some parties moved away, but the general gist is it goes into that right-wing direction. And so then, if you look at this, we have this is the summary. Where we do have the right-wing position shifts is where these parties are relevant. So the Czech Republic and Estonia, that is not surprising, don't show as much right-wing position shifts as the other countries. This is a summary measure of Galtan and ethnic minority. And it's usually lasting. And the mainstream right is affected, but also in some cases the mainstream left. That's an interesting question for Western Europe. Does it happen there? Some people say in Denmark it's happening. The Social Democrats in Denmark are more rigid on migration and border issues, but they're not going the same way as the, let's say, Smer in the Slovak Republic. Normally, left-wing parties in Western Europe shy away from cooperating with far-right parties. That's not the case in Eastern Europe. There's more fluidity in the party system. So, next point, policies, and then I'm going to finish with the democracy assessment. That was the most tricky part of the project. How do you measure policy shifts? Well, I had some money, so I had subcontracted PhD students in all the countries through my network. So I offered them short-term contracts to research, because we don't speak those languages. This is really difficult. It's easier in Western Europe with the language issue. So we had all these nationals in these countries studying newspapers and archives, legislative records. So we looked at, did the radical right initiate a legislative shift? Did they propose a bill on minority issues? What kind of bill? What direction? How did other parties react? Did they pick it up? So was a law enacted, or was there an administrative measure in response to that initiative? And that was a lot of qualitative work in the field, if you want, groundwork. And it was very uneven in terms of what came back to us, because in some countries we didn't get a whole lot, in other countries there was a very good production, so we had to fill some gaps here and play around with some gaps. But overall, the results are satisfying enough and robust to show that there have been shifts in these policies. So if you look at minority and asylum, which we separated then in 2016, 15 and 16 as the endpoints, we see in minority issues usually a policy shift along with the position shifts of the mainstream parties, not so much in the asylum question. This has to do with the EU and the technical aspect of asylum laws, because many of the asylum directives or legislation was basically mandatory, because the EU passed a new directive and then the countries had to implement that. There was very little room to diverge from that. So the shifts were minimal. There were some shifts in Poland, for example, or in Hungary, especially in the latter years. But overall, the shifts were not as strong as in the minority issues. But there have been shifts that we could detect in most of these countries. Again, in the Czech Republic and Estonia, the overall shifts were limited compared to the other countries. So finally, democracy effects. How does all this translate into democratic development? This is one of the tables we put together after lots of other tables. The last chapter is full of tables. We used the VDEM data set, that is a measurement of democratic quality. because they had a lot of indicators that we found useful, especially in terms of minority issues of inclusiveness. That was one of the advantages. It's not in this table because, as I said, there are lots of tables. This is a summary table of the most important findings. We used the average for democratic quality in the first decade of the new century or millennium, and then the democratic quality average for the second. And when you see numbers in bold, that means a decline in democratic quality. And this is very neat, except for the Czech Republic, because everywhere the radical right played a role, and there was a governmental participation, and you could see this in a moment, also policy shifts, democratic quality went down, measured by someone else who didn't know anything about our data. So this is an independent measure. It's not a result of our own measurement, but this is what we took to put together. There's a strong correlation. Look at this. Mainstream parties position to the right, policy shifts to the right, toward the radical right positions, and democratic decline. This is the bold countries. The only case that doesn't fit is the Czech Republic. They didn't need a radical right party at all to move into a lesser democratic direction. That's what comparative research is good for. When you have the overview, then you see the outliers or the exceptions, and then you have to ask questions. So this is where case studies should kick in. Someone should then look at the Czech Republic in particular to explain why they don't fit the pattern that the other parties fit. But you see the 4 countries in the upper left, very neat. The problem is we cannot separate the policy position shifts and the policy or legislation shifts. Every time there was a position shift in the mainstream, we also have a policy shift. So we cannot say the one is more important than the other. We need more data to maybe start a statistical analysis on this. We didn't do that. We leave it for others because then we were already exhausted, the money ran out, we had to come to a conclusion. So what is my conclusion? Let me very briefly summarize this. You can read this, but you can also just listen. There has been an impact, especially minority issues, and overall democratic decline corresponds to these impacts in these countries. But also there's an impact beyond these countries. There's an impact on the EU because the tensions rise between these countries and the EU when these things happen. And there is a message to other countries in the West that the radical right in the East sends. Especially Viktor Orban has become the hero of many in Western Europe on the far right. This is how we should do it. And finally, they also get together across the old Iron Curtain and have party alliances, which didn't happen until 2020. The European Parliament is full of stories where these caucuses break apart, even among West European parties. When they finally got one with Wilders and Marine Le Pen together, the Identity and Democracy Caucus, they didn't invite the East European parties, the usual suspect, because they were too extreme for them. They didn't want to be tainted. They didn't invite the Confederacja or the Slovak National Party. They said, no, it's too fishy. There were some individual deputies from these countries that fit, but only now they have started to do a cross alliance with Tomio Omakura from the Czech Republic, the SPD leader, not the Social Democratic Party, this is Freedom and Direct Democracy, far-right party. So finally they got together with some of them and they invite them. But there are also now 2 fractions, not one, in the European Parliament. But there's spillover from the East to the West, which leads us to the conclusion, if there is a problem with democracy, then the East shows us where we're headed. Ex oriente lux, as the Romans used to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. Wonderful presentation. I don't think that's what you have now in the room. It was super engaging, and I think it's really showing an impressive way of doing research that has both the comparative aspect, the kind of data analysis, and that is really trying to tackle this or disentangle this notion of what does that mean, the mainstreamization of the far right, and how can we try to capture and measure the impact it has on the broader political system. So I'm happy to open the floor for Q&A. I myself maybe in fact I can launch one first question. you have a part about how mainstream parties are reacting to the rise of far-right party, and so you have the kind of cooptation strategy or accommodation, and then the more kind of stigmatization. How do you think the reaction of mainstream party accelerate or slow down the influence of far-right party on the general narrative?
Well, the more cooperation there is, the more influence there is, because they see this with Fidesz, that picked up a lot of the Jobbik program. There was a study in Hungary that showed the congruence of the Fidesz platform with Jobbik demands. Was amazingly high congruence. So once this happens, the doors are open. And then it depends, of course, on the parliamentary process and on how big that party is, whether the opposition is interested or not in resisting that. Sometimes they just are lukewarm in their response. Maybe some of them think it's not so bad after all. As I said, the borders between left and right in the East are much more fluid. I mean, there's a lot of back and forth, and SPD and the Smer in Slovak Republic and the Bulgarian Socialist Party show how open they are to the influence of the radicals. So yeah, once they adopt a positive engagement strategy, it doesn't have to be full cooperation. Cooptation is enough. And this is a message to everyone else in Europe. If you want to steal voters and you copy their program, this could be an own goal in language of soccer. Because then you are a copy of what they want, and Le Pen has shown this. People like Le Pen better than Sarkozy, especially when he sells out as president after 5 years. You know, look at Sarkozy when was it, 2017? Or 12, right? 2012. He stole lots of voters from the Front National because he went to the far right and on migration, on law and order. But then he messed up as a president. And he lost his credibility. There were scandals, a whole string of scandals. And then in the next parliamentary election, 5 years later, the Front National came back with a vengeance. It went up almost triple what they had 5 years earlier. So he basically helped them by not being a good president. That's a big message. If you co-opt the platform, it's risky business, and usually it doesn't work. But you do the business of these parties, but you don't necessarily keep the voters, because one wrong move and the voters leave again and go back to the far right. And the far right looks more credible than before. See, that's the dynamic of party interaction.
Thank you. Let's open the floor for questions. Yes, sir. If you can introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Mark Gazda. I'm studying the MIPP program here at GW. This kind of came through my email, so I was like, oh, let me show up and see, because this is a particular area of interest of mine. I am specifically looking at the whole idea of illiberalism and de-democratization in ECE countries, and Czech Republic in particular. It's funny that you mentioned that. My question is, I guess, a bit of a two-parter. The first one is have you had a chance to take a look at the sort of interaction between government actors, the mainstream political parties in the right being political parties, and non-state actors like think tanks and private funders, see how that sort of impacts the political process? And the second thing is the Visegrad Four.
What's
the Visegrad Four? Visegrad Four, the Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Czech Republic. They're sort of a mini alliance within the ECE countries, and how that may potentially be manipulated by the existing political parties like Fidesz for their own advantage, to kind of try to get those countries to shift over to their to follow their sort of processes. I know they've been somewhat successful with Slovakia in particular. I'm not so sure how much of an impact they had with Czech Republic, but they certainly had impact at the whole immigration/asylum question in Czech Republic to their advantage.
Thank you.
Okay, should I?
Yeah,
okay.
I think we can take one by one.
Yes, we wanted to do what you addressed in your first point. We wanted to look at these parties and the non-party actors. Not so much think tanks, because this is really hard to find out empirically what they do, and how they affect, because they don't want this to be known. This is not public knowledge. It's very hard to access, so we would have to go there and do a lot of interviews on site, and the project wouldn't allow for that. But what we, at least in part, looked at is the movement sector. This is one of my research agendas, is looking at party movement interaction on the far right. Because far right parties have a lot of movement characteristics compared to mainstream parties and even left-wing parties. They're always in flux, they're always challenging, they're usually against everyone else, and then in the end against the whole order, and the particular elites in particular. So that's one thing, and then you see a lot of movement party interaction in the history of far-right parties. The most prominent and brutal example is the Nazi Party in Germany and the SA. They created their own movement to go around and terrorize people in the streets, do street politics for the party. And this is exactly what Jobbik did with the Hungarian Guard. They copied that, or maybe they didn't even have to copy it because they had the Arrowhead movement already in the 30s as a model, which actually was banned by Horthy, who was a far-right authoritarian dictator, which was weird. Horthy banned them because they were too extreme, even for him. Then Horthy was displaced because the Nazis didn't like him anymore as an ally, and they put the arrow cross into the government of Hungary during World War II. So there is already this predecessor of movement party interaction. And in the East, unlike in the West, movements are much more closely allied to these parties. And parties are much more open to embrace the movements. Even in Germany, the AfD in the East cooperates with Pegida and with some other of these movements much more than in the West. In the West, they stay away. And what Le Pen did in France, for example, he absorbed a lot of these movements into the Front National. Rather than rivaling them or cooperating with them, he tried to get rid of them by inviting them into the party and integrating them into the party. So a colleague in France called this the movement party too. Or he's called in the Sous movement, or something like that. Guy Birnbaum wrote that book. So there's this model in the West. You don't want to be associated with the movements, you keep a little distance, or you get rid of them by inviting them in, absorbing them. In the East, you take whatever ally you find, or you create the movement if there is none, like in the Hungarian case. So those movements then feed back into the party. They are usually much more radical than the party because they don't have to play according to the rules of the electoral game. So, but once they exist and cooperate with the parties, they pull those parties to the right. The same with Kotleba. That started as a movement in the Slovak Republic, the guy with the military uniform. Now he's a member of parliament, respected member of parliament, leader of that party in the caucus in Bratislava. So we've seen cases where these movements did have impact on the parties and keeping them in line with the radical agenda. Or threatening to withdraw when they became too soft on certain issues. But other actors, it's very hard. You know, there's a big debate, probably here as well, about Putin's influence or Moscow and the radical right in all of Europe. There are some cases like the Front National. I think there was one case when they found out that there's some money that came from Moscow. We don't know how much that is and how you measure that influence. That, you know, when they send money to support, of course it's always good to have that money. You have a resource, you can work with that. But if you do what the sender of the money wants, is a different question. Maybe you take the money and placate them a little bit, you know, do some symbolic things, but you do what you always do and keep your own course. It's hard to empirically study in a comparative way. You have to have case studies on that. And then you have to have a very good theory to extrapolate from that. But in terms of the movement party interaction, that's what I found in Eastern Europe, much more collaboration, and that also means a congruence in what they want vis-a-vis their opponents. And the second point, Visegrad 4, just quickly, I'm not sure that is a really working alliance, because if you look at the relationship between these four countries, they're not without some tensions, right? Especially Slovak Republic and Hungary, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Maybe the Poles are the most relaxed about this, and they're also the biggest in the group, so they can say, well, you do the little things. In the end, we decide on our own, and so we decide what we copy from Orban or what we don't copy from Orban, because there was some copying going on. I mean, Orban was useful as a role model, but then also Kaczynski said, well, we shouldn't keep copying too much, so we have our own Polish way, for example, religion, very important in Poland, as you know. So I would say it's not really an alliance. I mean, they get together on certain points where they find commonalities, but they don't have many, except the regional situation. So with 2015, yes, they were all of the same mind, that we don't want those refugees in our country. But then with the Ukrainians, it's already different. There are lots of Ukrainians in Poland for obvious reasons, not so many in Hungary. And Orban is not a big fan of having any refugees in Hungary. So again, Visegrad didn't do anything here in bringing them really together.
So my name is Grant. I work here at the Illiberalism Studies Program, and some of my recent research has dealt with the European Conservatives and Reformists.
Which one?
The European Conservatives and Reformists. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of the highest level European, the European Parliament, and how European integration might be affected in one way or another by the introduction of some of these far-right parties, some of which are from Eastern Europe, like Law and Justice in Poland. I believe SAS from Slovakia was one of the ones in your study. They're part of the ECR, and they're working with other far-right parties from the West, like Vox from Spain and Fratelli d'Italia from Italy. And so could you talk a little bit about how this formerly kind of center-right parliamentary group has been pushed to the right by the introduction of far-right parties from both East and West Europe, and just generally more about the European level?
Well, I'm sorry, but I'll have to disappoint you. That's the domain of my co-author. She is the EU freak among us. I do comparative research and I try to ignore the EU as much as possible. And she always brings it back in. So she's really the one who could answer that question well. I don't know too much about that interaction at the European parliamentary level. All I see is there's also a lot of fluidity in the situation, because groups break up, others come. And the far right, as you know, doesn't have a single caucus, because it's really hard to agree on these issues, especially nationalists in an international association. That doesn't work as well as with liberals or socialists or even communists. So in that way, I expect this always to be temporary from my own studying of the radical right, because they are much more focused on the national level. They use the EU level for whatever they can get, the money, the attention, but the real arena is the national level. And everything they do in Brussels or Strasbourg has to do with what they want on the national level, much more than other parties. That's my general conclusion.
More questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Bobby Herman. I'm a non-resident senior democracy fellow at Freedom House, where I spent many, many years. And I'm actually heading to Poland and to Slovakia in 2 weeks. So it's part of a project I'm doing with another organization. You've touched on this, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what is the process, and there's probably not one process, but what's the process whereby mainstream parties either become radicalized, or, as we've seen here in the United States, and I don't know if it's the same, but they also become what I would call the enabling class. Is that also part of what's going on in these parts of the world?
Okay, good question. There are several trajectories. First, is it always the same, or is it different in terms of the region in which that happens? As I said already, in Eastern Europe, the political boundaries are much more in flux, so it's easier to move around. If you look at Fidesz and PiS, they had an impulse early on, and that was LPR in the Polish case, and MIEP in the Hungarian case. That's where I would say it started. Until then, there were mainstream right parties. MIEP already pushed Fidesz into the far-right direction, because MIEP was a big fan of Greater Hungary, was their main issue basically, and Orban, this is another thing that's also specific in Eastern Europe, the strong man in the parties. In Eastern Europe, individual leaders are much stronger in general than in the West, even on the far right. Marine Le Pen has to deal with a lot of different groups, or look at the AfD in Germany. Every 2 years a new leadership, there's a sorting out going on, it's not very stable. Now they have found a certain level of stability, but normally what you have in the West, you have the infighting in these parties, especially when they grow, you have different wings, and it requires a lot of management, and you cannot just do what Mussolini was doing in the 20s. That's different in Eastern Europe because, again, there is so much room for maneuver that strong people like Orban or the Kaczynski brothers can organize the parties top-down with relatively little resistance. There are more people there that like to follow the leader than in the West now.
Yeah.
There's more, even in the far right, there is more resistance or opposition than in many of these cases in Eastern Europe. There's this top-down approach to politics. So if you have a skillful leader like Orban and a popular person in the general sense as a leader of the opposition, that is very helpful in taking over the party and moving it wherever you want it. So Orban saw that MIEP was a threat, and he started a few laws. You may remember this, the status law of 2002, trying to get the Hungarians abroad into the fold. His ideal was in the end to give them citizenship. That didn't work out. The neighbor countries had a problem. Even the voting rights already was a problem. So Slovakia and Romania protested heavily that the Hungarians in their country, who were Slovak and Romanian citizens, should get voting rights for the Budapest Parliament, said this is a no-go. Let's stop this. So EU also interfered and said if you want to be a member, stop this business, like in Estonia too with the citizenship laws. The EU had some real impact there at this point in preventing these parties or countries from going that way. But he did something underneath at that level, giving health benefits to Hungarians living in the neighbor countries. That worked. And the other countries couldn't do anything. If they went to Hungary, they would get the full package of health benefits in the hospitals. So this was the small version of Greater Hungary that Orban in 2002 already started, not later. So this was the first push in the direction. And then, of course, there was the opposition time, which is a great time for radicalization. Usually, and you see this also in other countries in the West, when these parties, mainstream right parties, are in the opposition, they try to become a real counterweight and alternative, except the CDU in Germany right now. Don't ask me why. That doesn't work. Merz is not doing what he's supposed to. He's trying, but it's not really productive. So, if you put this together, strong personality, a particular impulse from the outside, and then the role you have either in government or in opposition, you can begin such a radicalization process. And then, of course, you need certain supporting factors. Other new parties on the far right, like Jobbik came, and also personnel questions. One of the most important things is who's running the party below the level of the individual leader. Yeah. So what's the leading personnel? And if you have a turnover, and many of these parties, when they grow, for example, they attract new activists, often from the far right too. And as this happened in peace. When the LPR disassembled after 2007, you know, the ultra-Catholic party that was in coalition with PiS, the first government with PiS, the PiS took up all these people who were looking for a political home. Radio Maria switched sides from LPR to PiS already before the breakup, because they thought LPR isn't doing enough for their ultra-Catholic cause. They copied some of the LPR agenda into the PiS platform. They took activists from LPR into PiS. So the party, by doing this, made a sharp right-wing turn after 2007. Then being in the opposition also helped, because then they had no governmental responsibility or coalition partner that would slow them down. So by the time the election 2015 came, they were in a position to come back as an almost far-right party. And if you look at the first government actions, they were a far-right party. So that's one trajectory, not the only one, but it's a strong one. Leadership and personnel is very important in that. You see this in the AfD as well. It didn't start as a radical right party in 2013. Now in the West, there are very few cases where this happens. Normally what happens in the West is that a mainstream right party has a wing that gets dissatisfied, and then rather than taking over the whole party, which is very complicated business, they split. The Republikaner in Germany was split of the CSU, and the AfD also first took a lot of disgruntled CSU people with them when they were formed in 2013. So that's, and the more radical ones then move. Again, it's a personnel question. Who is in the party? Who has the power to define the agenda? And that's, I think, the most important factor.
Thank you.
Great. Well, with that, we are already running out of time. I'm sorry, we have to stop here,
No, I'm sorry I
unfortunately.
talked too
But
much.
no, absolutely not. I think everybody wanted to get your feedback. But please, thank you again, Michael, for
Thank
joining
you.
us. Congratulations for the book. Thank you so much. And if there are more questions, they can be asked
Yes.
in a